"Mom, you're too old to understand how things work now. Just let us handle everything." Rachel said it so casually, like she was reminding me to take my vitamins, like it was something obvious, something everyone in the room already agreed with. Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't even hesitate. He just nodded, cutting into his steak like nothing important had just been said. I kept my hands folded in my lap for a moment longer than usual before reaching for my fork, careful, steady, as if nothing inside me had shifted. The dining room looked exactly the same as it had for the past 27 years. The same polished oak table. The same chandelier casting a warm, golden light. The same framed photos along the wall, each one holding a memory I had built piece by piece. But something was different now. Something invisible had moved. I took a small bite of my food. I couldn't taste it. Across from me, Rachel was already talking about renovations. Expanding the kitchen. Replacing the hardwood floors. Turning the study into a nursery. Plans. Decisions. All of it spoken as if I were no longer part of the equation. As if I were just another piece of furniture in the room. "We've been thinking," Daniel added, finally looking up, though not quite at me, "it's probably best if we start taking over the finances too. Just to make things easier for you." Easier. That word settled into the silence between us. I nodded once. Slow. Controlled. "Of course," I said, my voice even, softer than I expected. Rachel smiled, satisfied. Daniel exhaled, like a problem had just been solved. And just like that, it was decided. Not discussed. Not questioned. Decided. I finished my plate, listening to them map out a future that no longer seemed to include me in any meaningful way. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I simply observed. The way Rachel leaned slightly forward when she spoke, like she was presenting something important. The way Daniel avoided my eyes, choosing instead to focus on anything else. The way they both relaxed the moment I agreed. That was the moment I understood. This hadn't started tonight. This had been building for a long time. Small decisions made without me. Conversations I wasn't invited into. Subtle shifts in tone. I had noticed them before, of course. I just hadn't named them. Not until now. After dinner, I cleared my plate and carried it to the kitchen. The sink was empty. The house was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, even though it was the same house I had lived in for decades. I rested my hands on the edge of the counter for a moment, looking out the window at the backyard. The same yard where Daniel used to run barefoot in the summer, laughing so loudly the neighbors could hear him 2 houses down. I remembered how he used to ask me for everything. Every decision. Every opinion. He used to say, "Mom, you always know what to do." I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was nothing humorous about it. Things change. People change. But not always in the way you expect. Behind me, I could hear Rachel's voice drifting from the living room, already discussing timelines, contractors, paperwork. Efficient. Confident. Certain. I turned on the faucet and let the water run over my hands, warm and steady. I dried them carefully, one finger at a time, the way I always did. Then I reached for the small drawer by the stove and opened it. Inside, everything was exactly where I had left it. Neat. Organized. Controlled. I closed the drawer again and stood there for a moment, very still. If they believed I was too old to decide anything, then they had already made their first mistake. And I was going to let them believe it. For now. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, just as I always had, even though there was no longer anyone expecting breakfast at 7 sharp or coffee waiting on the warmer. The house was quiet in a way that felt deeper than silence, like the walls themselves were holding something back. I sat at the edge of my bed for a moment, my hands resting on my knees, letting the stillness settle around me. Then I stood, smoothed the front of my robe, and walked downstairs. The kitchen looked untouched, exactly as I had left it the night before. Clean counters. Dishes put away. Everything in its place. I moved through the space slowly, almost deliberately, as if I were seeing it for the first time. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, measuring the grounds carefully, the way I had done for years. The familiar routine steadied me. I poured a cup and carried it to the small table by the window. Outside, the backyard was pale with early morning light, the grass still damp from overnight dew. For a moment, everything felt unchanged. But then I heard footsteps upstairs. Quick. Purposeful. Not mine. Rachel came down first, already dressed, already holding her phone, her attention fixed on the screen. Daniel followed a few steps behind, adjusting his watch, his expression focused in that distant way he had adopted over the past few years. Neither of them noticed me right away. They were talking quietly to each other, voices low, like they were continuing a conversation that had started long before I entered the room. "We should call the bank today," Rachel said. "It will be easier if we consolidate everything into one place." Daniel nodded. "I will take care of it after lunch. We should also review the documents in the study." Documents. Bank. Consolidate. I took a slow sip of my coffee and set the cup down carefully. The word study lingered in my mind. That room had always been my husband's. After he passed, it became the one place in the house that still felt entirely mine. I kept important papers there. Old letters. Financial records. Things that mattered. Rachel finally looked up and saw me. Her smile appeared instantly, practiced and smooth. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, her tone bright, almost cheerful. "We did not want to wake you." "I have always woken up early," I replied. My voice was calm. Even. Daniel gave me a brief nod. "Morning, Mom." He hesitated for a second, as if he might say something more, but then he did not. Instead, he reached for a glass, filled it with water, and leaned against the counter. Rachel stepped closer to the table, placing her phone down for just a moment. "We were just talking about getting everything organized," she said. "It will take a lot off your shoulders." I nodded again. "That sounds efficient." The word seemed to please her. She smiled wider. "Exactly." They finished their conversation without including me. Plans were made. Calls were scheduled. Decisions were outlined. I remained at the table, listening, saying nothing unless spoken to. When they left the room, I waited until I heard the front door close before I stood up. The house returned to silence, but it no longer felt empty. It felt observed. I walked down the hallway toward the study, my steps slow and measured. The door was slightly open. That was new. I always closed it. I paused for a moment, then pushed it open fully. At first glance, everything looked the same. The desk. The shelves. The neatly stacked folders. But as I stepped inside, I noticed the small differences. The top drawer of the desk was not fully aligned. A folder on the shelf was slightly out of place. Subtle changes. Easy to miss if you were not paying attention. I crossed the room and opened the drawer. The documents inside were still there, but they had been shifted, handled, reviewed. Someone had gone through them. I closed the drawer gently, my fingers lingering on the handle for just a moment. Then I turned and looked around the room, taking in every detail. Nothing was missing. Not yet. But something had already begun. I walked back into the hallway, closing the study door behind me with quiet precision. If they were preparing to take control, then they were already moving faster than they thought. And if they believed I had not noticed, then they had just made their second mistake. I did not confront them that day, or the next. Instead, I watched. It is remarkable what people reveal when they believe you have stopped paying attention. By the third morning, patterns began to form. Rachel was always the first to speak, the one who introduced ideas as if they had already been agreed upon. Daniel followed, quieter, reinforcing her decisions with small nods and brief confirmations. It was not loud or aggressive. It was careful, polished, almost polite. That made it easier for them to believe it was justified. That same afternoon, I noticed the mail had been moved from its usual place. It was no longer on the small wooden tray by the entryway. Instead, it sat on the kitchen counter, already opened, sorted into neat stacks. I stepped closer and glanced at the envelopes. Bank statements. Utility bills. A letter from an investment firm my husband had worked with for years. The envelopes had all been opened with clean, precise edges. Not torn. Not rushed. Intentional. Rachel walked in just as I picked one up. "Oh, I went through the mail this morning," she said lightly, as if she were mentioning the weather. "Just to keep things organized." I looked at her for a moment, then placed the letter back exactly where it had been. "Of course," I said. She smiled again, that same controlled expression that never quite reached her eyes. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly." Handled. That word again. Later that evening, Daniel asked me a question he had never asked before. "Mom, do you remember where you keep the backup copies of your documents?" His tone was casual, but there was something underneath it. Something rehearsed. I met his gaze, holding it just long enough to notice the flicker of discomfort before he looked away. "Yes," I said simply. He nodded quickly, almost relieved that I had not asked why. "Good. That is good." He did not press further. Neither did I. Instead, I excused myself and returned to the study. The room felt smaller now, though nothing had physically changed. I sat down at the desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one I rarely touched unless necessary. Inside were older files. Records from years ago. Documents that most people would consider outdated. I flipped through them slowly, one page at a time, until I found what I was looking for. My husband had always been thorough. Meticulous, even. He believed in preparation, in understanding that circumstances could change in ways no one expected. I remembered the night he sat at this very desk, explaining everything to me in calm, steady detail. "You may not need this," he had said, "but if you ever do, you will be glad you know where it is." At the time, I had smiled and told him he worried too much. Now, as I held the folder in my hands, I understood exactly what he meant. I closed it carefully and returned it to its place, making sure everything looked untouched. Then I stood and walked to the window, looking out into the fading light of the backyard. The air was still. Quiet. Almost expectant. Down the hall, I could hear Rachel's voice again, speaking on the phone this time. "Yes, we are just finalizing a few things," she said. "It should be straightforward." Straightforward. I leaned slightly closer to the doorway, not enough to be seen, but enough to hear the rhythm of her words. "Once everything is in place, there will not be any complications." No complications. I stepped back and returned to the center of the room. So that was the plan. Clean. Efficient. Controlled. They believed they were simplifying things. Reducing risk. Removing uncertainty. I reached for the desk, resting my fingertips lightly against the polished surface. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel it. The quiet shift of realization. Not anger. Not sadness. Something colder. Clearer. They were not just taking control. They were preparing to erase me from the decisions entirely. And they believed I would let them. I straightened my posture, smoothing the front of my sweater as if I were preparing for a meeting. Then I turned off the light and left the study, closing the door behind me with the same quiet precision as before. If they were building something behind my back, then it was time I started building something of my own. And I would do it the same way they were. Quietly. Carefully. Without drawing attention. Because the most dangerous mistake they had made was not what they said to me. It was what they assumed about me afterward. I did not rush into anything the next day. I followed my routine the same way I always had, down to the smallest detail, because routines have a way of making people comfortable, and comfortable people stop looking closely. I woke up early, made coffee, watered the plants by the kitchen window, and read through the newspaper without reacting to a single headline. When Daniel came downstairs, he gave me a quick glance, almost as if he were checking something, measuring whether I had changed overnight. I had not. At least not in any way he could see. "Morning, Mom," he said. "Good morning," I replied, folding the newspaper neatly and setting it aside. He lingered for a second, then opened the refrigerator, scanning the shelves as if he had never done it before. "We might need to start making a grocery list together," he said. "So we can keep things more efficient." Efficient. Always that word. I nodded. That sounds reasonable. Rachel joined us a few minutes later, already dressed, already moving with that same quiet certainty. She placed her phone on the counter and looked between us. "I have an appointment this afternoon," she said. "Just to go over some options. Nothing major." Options. Another word that did not need explaining because it explained itself. Daniel nodded again. "That is good. The sooner we get everything sorted, the better." I stood up, rinsed my cup, and placed it carefully in the sink. "I am going to run a few errands," I said. Rachel smiled politely. "Do you need help with anything?" The question was not about helping. It was about knowing where I would be. "No," I said. "I prefer to take care of it myself." I picked up my keys and my purse, both exactly where I had left them, and walked toward the front door. As I stepped outside, the air felt cooler than I expected, a light breeze moving through the quiet street. The neighborhood looked unchanged. Same houses. Same trimmed lawns. Same stillness that had always made this place feel safe. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the silence settle around me. My destination was not random. It was deliberate. A small office building on the edge of town, one I had not visited in years but had never forgotten. The sign outside was modest, the kind most people would pass without noticing. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I remembered the last time I had walked through those doors. My husband had been beside me, his presence steady, reassuring, as he introduced me to a man who listened more than he spoke. "If anything ever changes," my husband had said quietly, "this is where you go." At the time, I had nodded, trusting him without fully understanding why it mattered. Now, I opened the car door and stepped out. The hallway inside smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Familiar. Unchanged. I approached the reception desk and gave my name. The woman behind the desk smiled politely, then made a quick call. "He will see you shortly," she said. I sat down in one of the chairs, my posture straight, my expression calm. When the door opened and he stepped out, I recognized him immediately, though his hair had turned more gray than I remembered. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady. "It has been a long time." "Yes," I replied, standing to meet him. "It has." He gestured for me to come inside. The office was quiet, organized, every file in its place. I sat across from his desk and folded my hands in my lap. He did not rush me. He simply waited. "Things at home have changed," I said finally. He nodded once, as if he had expected those exact words. "Tell me," he said. And so I did. Not everything. Not all at once. Just enough. Enough for him to understand the direction things were moving in. Enough for him to see what Daniel and Rachel believed they were building. When I finished, he leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Your husband prepared for this possibility," he said. "He wanted to make sure you would never be placed in a position where your voice could be ignored." I held his gaze, steady. "And am I?" I asked. He allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "No," he said. "You are not." I nodded once, feeling the quiet certainty settle into place. "Good," I said. When I left the office, the air outside felt different. Not lighter. Not warmer. Just clearer. I drove home at the same measured pace, parked in the driveway, and stepped inside without hesitation. Rachel's voice drifted from the living room again, calm and controlled, already planning something I had not yet been invited to hear. Daniel was somewhere nearby, moving through the house like he belonged to a version of it that no longer existed. I set my keys down and walked past them without stopping, my expression unchanged, my movement steady. If they were moving pieces into place, then so was I. The only difference was that I understood the board far better than they did. The shift became more visible after that day, not in loud declarations or sudden changes, but in the quiet way control began to settle into their hands as if it had always belonged there. Rachel started spending more time in the study, always with a reason that sounded reasonable on the surface. Organizing. Reviewing. Preparing. Each word chosen carefully, each action framed as something helpful. Daniel followed her lead, asking fewer questions and offering more confirmations, as though he had already accepted a version of reality where his role was to support rather than to think. I let it happen. I stayed where they expected me to stay, spoke when spoken to, and agreed when it cost me nothing to agree. One afternoon, Rachel approached me with a small stack of papers in her hand, her expression composed, almost gentle. "Margaret, we thought it might be a good idea to simplify a few things," she said, placing the papers on the table in front of me. "Nothing complicated. Just making sure everything is easier to manage moving forward." I looked down at the pages without touching them. The layout was clean, professional, familiar enough to recognize the intention without needing to read every word. Authorization, access, permission. The language was careful, but the meaning was not subtle. I lifted my eyes to meet hers. "You have already thought this through," I said. It was not a question. She smiled, just slightly. "We just want to make sure you do not have to worry about anything." Daniel stood a few feet away, watching, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. I nodded slowly. "Of course," I said. "That makes sense." The relief that passed between them was immediate, though they tried to hide it. Rachel pushed the papers a little closer to me. "We can go over them together," she offered. "Or if you prefer, you can sign them now and we will take care of the rest." I reached for the pen beside the papers, turning it once between my fingers as if I were considering something small and insignificant. "I trust you," I said, my voice steady, my expression calm. Then I set the pen down again without signing anything. "But I would like to read them first. Properly." Rachel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but it was there. "Of course," she said quickly. "Take your time." I gathered the papers neatly and stood up. "I will look at these this evening," I added. Daniel nodded, satisfied. "No rush, Mom. We just want to help." Help. I carried the documents back to the study, closing the door behind me with quiet precision. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I understood exactly what was happening within its walls. I sat at the desk and placed the papers in front of me, aligning them carefully. Then I opened the drawer where I had left the folder the day before. It was still there, untouched, waiting. I took it out and placed it beside the new documents. For a moment, I simply looked at both stacks. One represented what they believed they were building. The other represented what had already been built long before they ever considered taking control. I opened the folder and reviewed the contents again, slower this time, more deliberate. Each page confirmed what I had begun to understand. My husband had not only prepared for uncertainty, he had anticipated manipulation. He had created safeguards that were not obvious to anyone who did not know where to look. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer, making sure everything appeared exactly as it had before. Then I picked up Rachel's papers and began to read them, line by line, without reacting, without rushing. By the time I finished, the plan was clear. They were not asking for permission. They were formalizing control. I stacked the pages neatly and set them aside. Then I leaned back in the chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. If they believed I would sign away my voice without understanding what it meant, then they had already committed to a decision they could not undo. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, not because anything had been resolved, but because everything was finally clear. That evening, I brought the papers back to the kitchen table just as Rachel had left them, placing them neatly in front of me as though nothing had changed since she handed them over. Daniel was already seated, scrolling through something on his phone, while Rachel stood by the counter, watching me in that quiet, attentive way she had perfected. I could feel her focus without needing to look up. I sat down slowly, smoothing the edges of the documents with my fingertips before folding my hands on top of them. "I went through everything," I said. My voice was calm, measured, giving nothing away. Daniel looked up immediately. Rachel turned slightly, her posture straightening. "And," she asked,